And good morning. Welcome to Speak Out. It is Tuesday, April 5th, 2022. A little shout out and theme music for the people of Eastern Ukraine as they've adopted the Twisted Sister classic, We're Not Gonna Take It, as their fight song against Russia during this, if you want to call it an invasion. It's kind of a retreat right now, so we'll see what happens there. Anyway, it is Tuesday, April 5th, 2022. I have a very, very, very special guest on the phone from the East Coast, and I'm going to introduce him. He spent 27 years as a special agent for the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, the Customs Service, and the Drug Enforcement Administration, also known as the DEA, of course. He's the best-selling author of the memoir, The Infiltrator, which was adapted into a major motion picture starring Bryan Cranston. He now has a second book called The Betrayal. His name is Robert Mazur. And again, welcome to the show, Robert Mazur. How are you, sir?
I'm fine, and thanks for inviting me. I appreciate it.
Oh, absolutely. You're also a court-certified expert in international drug trafficking and money laundering, and the president of a company called KYC Solutions Incorporated. Kind of get into that a little bit. What's KYC Solutions?
Sure. Well, I deal quite a bit in the private sector, in the profession that handles anti-money laundering compliance for major financial institutions and financial service providers that work in the private sector and have responsibilities of making notice to the U.S. government with regard to suspicious transactions and different types of transactions that appear to be related to illicit activity. So I oftentimes speak around the world to audiences. I just 2 weeks ago was in Cairo. I'm going to be heading to Europe here in the not too distant future, and I've been all over the Far East and Europe and in the Caribbean, U.S., speaking to groups in a keynote or in a master class, trying to help them to educate them about the things they need to know about how to mitigate money laundering risk, how to protect the reputation of their institutions. And I also provide instruction to law enforcement officers on issues like undercover techniques and managing undercover operations, managing informants, those types of things. And then I also do consulting work in the financial sector, trying to help them to improve their anti-money laundering compliance activities. I am currently an expert witness in two litigations, one and both of which have claimed that major financial institutions knowingly laundered money for drug cartels that they knew full well were terrorists, and unfortunately that resulted in those terrorist organizations murdering Americans who were on foreign soil. And so we represent the families of the people who were killed.
Well, now I find it very interesting that you do public speaking, and that because I watched a clip of you on your website. It's robertmazur.com, by the way. Robert, of course, MAZUR.com. And you were on the Charlie Rose show, which was on PBS, but they had you blurred out. They covered your identity. Is that still the case this many years later?
Yeah, unlike contracts with Lloyd's of London, there aren't papers here that people are able to go to read whether or not the contract has been canceled or not. So, I think just like any other law enforcement officer who's worked in long-term undercover, I just take what I think are reasonable steps to attempt to minimize my exposure on the internet, at least with respect to my current likeness. And I'm not the only law enforcement officer that's found it necessary to do that type of thing. So I'm pretty selective about where and when I'll speak, and I generally do not speak at events that are advertised publicly in advance. Usually they are for organizations, for their employees or their clients, that are internally publicized with an understanding that until the event's over, they're not going to put it out on social media.
No, I got you. So your first book was The Infiltrator, and it was made into a film with Bryan Cranston. and John Leguizamo is in that as well as your partner. Let's talk about that a little bit. How accurate is the film version starring Bryan Cranston?
Well, there's no doubt that Hollywood took license to embellish certain things. If I had to guess, I'd say maybe 75% of it was accurate. But as the people involved in producing the film told me time and time again, when I would raise some question about why it was appropriate to fictionalize certain things, if I heard it once, I heard it 1,000 times. Bob, this is not a documentary. This is a film, and we're here to share something that's entertaining and based on a true story. And I'd say that that's probably the best explanation of it. And besides Cranston and Leguizamo, Benjamin Bratt was in it. I thought he did an outstanding job, and Diane Kruger, who is an excellent actor, also did a great job.
Were you on the set as a consultant?
Quite a bit, yes. Most of the filming was actually done in the UK, principally because of the tax credits that were afforded to filmmakers in the UK. For every dollar you spent, you got 25% tax credit. So some states within the United States offer that, which is why states like Georgia really do get a focus of filmmakers who want to go there and shoot. But at that particular time, Florida was not funding their tax credits for filmmaking. So although some of it was shot in the Tampa Bay area, most of it was actually shot over in the UK.
So I have to ask this because you've had aliases in the past. Is Robert Mazur your real name?
Yeah, it sure is.
Oh, okay, because you've had aliases, and I'm curious, how do you pick those aliases? I saw how you did it in the film. Is that the way you do it in real life?
Well, you basically got two options. One, you can completely falsify birth certificates and other documentation to support your identity. The problem with that is, obviously birth certificates are a matter of public record, so right. If somebody really wanted to work hard enough, they could, and it's not really that hard, they can go to the county where you supposedly were born and see if there is in fact a birth certificate that's there, which is why some people suggest at the time, and I don't know whether it's still a practice now, but that you go to a cemetery and find an infant death and then build from there, because there's going to be a birth certificate with that name that's going to be there.
But it would be an infant then.
Yeah, because you don't want to have somebody who died at the age of 30 who had their own profile that now you've got to somehow fit into. So generally speaking, when I in the Infiltrator matter, I was blessed with leadership that had enough foresight to recognize that you can't just make a false identity overnight. And so I got the opportunity back in that one to spend about 18 months putting together what I think is one of the more sophisticated fronts that was ever used in long-term undercover money laundering cases. And I believe my backstopping was pretty darn solid. I put most of it together myself, and those things that our headquarters office suggested that were not very good ideas, I rejected, because unfortunately, as I was taught when I went through undercover schools, you want to make sure that to the extent that you have the ability to do it on your own, you want to backstop yourself, because if you rely on somebody in headquarters who did something and they made a mistake, or they wound up doing things in a way that could compromise you, you'll never know until you're compromised. So I built most of it on my own.
Wow, this is just fascinating, and we're only slicing into the interview. Robert Mazur is on with us. He'll be on the whole hour, and he's author of The Betrayal, the true story of my brush with death in the world of narcos and launderers. And if you want to ask Robert a question, give us a call, 928-854-KNTR, 928-854-5687. And I have to ask you, what was your background before you got into this kind of work?
Well, and it's one of the reasons that I felt as though that my volunteering as a long-term undercover agent to be a, quote, corrupt businessman made sense, because unlike many of my colleagues, I was not a criminal justice major. I was a business administration finance major, and I was one course short of getting an accounting degree. And I had worked in a bank, and I'd worked in a brokerage firm. And so I really knew the financial world. I'd also been an IRS special agent conducting very technical paper chase type investigations in financial crime. So I was very, very comfortable when it was important for me to portray myself as a businessman, and I also had some very good informants that really helped tremendously to embed me in real businesses. These weren't just government storefronts when the lights went on when the bad guys were in town and off when they were gone. These were real businesses that operated, 24/7 like any other business. So I was embedded in an investment company, a mortgage brokerage business. We had an air charter service with a private jet that went from the Tampa Bay area over to the Bahamas. We had a jewelry chain with 30 locations on the East Coast, and I was also embedded in a brokerage firm with a seat on the New York Stock Exchange. So I didn't have to be the very best undercover agent in the world. I was well armed with resources that caused bad guys to think that I was extraordinarily credible with regard to who it is that I was saying I was.
Interesting. So how does the DEA or other agencies choose an undercover agent? Why do you think they chose you?
Well, first of all, it's a volunteer job.
Oh.
And then because you can't be forced to do undercover work. The first two agencies I was with, the IRS Criminal Investigations and what's now Homeland Security Investigations, they had undercover schools that I attended. In order to even be a candidate to go to those schools, you have to go through a psychological testing. Somehow I snuck through, and they thought that I was psychologically well enough balanced to be able to endure the unusual impacts of living a double life for years on end. And then I went through the undercover schools, which were tremendous, because not only was there a psychologist that was involved in helping us to open our eyes to how important it was for us to stay grounded. It was also long-term undercover agents who had previously done the job, who were part of the instruction staff, that really brought a lot of credibility into the classroom. One of the former long-term undercover agents who mentored me and who I'm still friends with as of this day is Joe Pistone, who's the former FBI agent who the book and the movie Donnie Brasco is based upon. So we really got quality instruction about many, many different things, especially things like how to enhance rapport and communication with others, and there's probably 10 different topics that were covered by the undercover schools that really prepared me for doing that type of work.
Yeah, I was going to ask you because I'm a big fan of the movie Donnie Brasco and Joe Pistone and that whole story. How do you acquire your information in Operation Don Brasco? That Pistone was obviously the agent. He used a tape recorder at first. Did you commit information to memory, and what kind of evidence did you gather that would hold up in court under chain of evidence?
Sure. Well, my partner and I must say that my partner, Amir Abreu, played by John Leguizamo in the Infiltrator film, is one of the very, very best undercover agents that's ever done the job. He had a much different task than me. He needed to be credible as kind of the street manager of the dirty side of my business, whereas I was the businessman who had the college degree and all of the sophisticated businesses in order to launder the money. But between Amir and I, we recorded roughly 1,200 conversations during the 2 years we were under in the story portrayed in The Infiltrator. And those were extraordinarily important because not only were we dealing with drug traffickers and money launderers, we were dealing with senior executives of what was the seventh largest privately held bank in the world, the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, BCCI, which none of the officers had any prior criminal offenses, and clearly were the type of individuals who they're very high-paid defense attorneys, and they did have those, could portray as people who just don't commit crime. But when you've got it locked down in recorded conversations, there's not very much wiggle room that's left. Plus, we did search warrants on most of the major branch locations and seized a lot of the records that supported the fact that they were definitely laundering funds for many different types of criminals who had what unfortunately many people on this planet have, which is money-seeking secrecy from governments. So BCCI, kind of like, and I firmly believe this, that there is a segment of the international banking and business community that markets this type of money and provides services to criminal organizations. And that could be clients who want to evade income taxes, or they want to, they're dealing in drugs or money laundering or pilfering treasuries or dealing with prohibited nations or illegally selling arms. All of them have the same need. Unfortunately, so does the intelligence community, and that is to have transactions carried out that conceal and disguise the source and the path of the funds. And the United Nations on Drugs and Crime did a study a few years ago attempting to identify how much is out there looking to be laundered every year. And that study purported that there was roughly $2 trillion a year seeking money laundering services, and of that, about $400 billion a year from the sale of illegal drugs. And I'd like to say that the government is quite good at identifying that money, but they're not. No doubt, at least 98% of that money is never seen by governments, never identified, which is why their coffers grow exponentially and why corruption is so massively an epidemic around the world today.
Right, right. Let's get into some of that work when we come back from our first break. We're talking with Robert Mazur. He has a website, robertmazur.com. You can get some more background. But we're talking about his new book. It's called The Betrayal, the true story of my brush with death in the world of narcos and launderers. And we'll be back with more in a moment. We're going to find out more about the Medellin cartel and the Cali cartel as well. And if you're okay with talking about that, we'll come back and we'll discuss that a little bit, Robert.
I'm happy to do it.
All right, thanks. Let's go to break. I'm Paul Lavoie. You're listening to Speak Out. Stay with us. We have Robert Mazur on the phone, and just found out he's a big NFL fan. And Glenn Frey, of course, in the movie Jerry Maguire, centered around the Arizona Cardinals. And you happen to be a little bit of a Bucs fan for a few years, you were telling me. All the way back to the creamsicle days?
Yeah, all the way back to the creamsicle days. I was there from day one, and but after 40 years, I bailed because I don't know. It was a different atmosphere. Taking grandkids to the game was not fun. Trying to get people to be civil. So
at least they weren't wearing paper bags, right?
Yeah, that's true. That's
all right.
True.
Speak Out brought to you in part by Mojave Mortgage, also Patio Paradise, samsguns.com, the Lewis team, now known as Remax by the Lake, also Bradley Chevrolet and Bradley Ford, Springburg Wealth Management, and by Kevin Barbarita and Barbarita Realty Consultants with over 35 years in the Laughlin community. Visit their websites at laughlinnevada.net and laughlinnevada.com. And I'll just let you know, Robert, if you want to listen back to the show, it's at kntrtalk.com, kntrtalk.com, and our archives are there as well, right under the Speak Out tab. So I wanted to get into your time with, the Pablo Escobar, the whole saga, just, his whole story just fascinates me, and the Medellin cartel in that. What was your involvement? This is your first book, by the way, that you cover that. It's The Infiltrator, and you had a hand in bringing down Pablo Escobar. That's crazy.
Well, really the two agents who were most responsible for taking Pablo Escobar down are Steve Murphy and Javier Pena, who you see portrayed on Netflix. But I preceded the work that they were doing there, and I think we accomplished quite a bit in identifying many of the extremely high-level people that were in the weeds working with Pablo Escobar. I ultimately became a money launderer for Escobar and some of the other members of the board of the cartel. My point of contact with the Medellin cartel, this doesn't happen overnight. It takes months and months, and in this case, it took me more than a year to earn enough credibility to sit down across the table from a guy who was the principal attorney and consigliere for Pablo Escobar, a guy by the name of Santiago Uribe.
Okay.
And he and other people who were very big in the cartel, the guy who was in charge of acquiring all the planes that were used for their Air Force transporters. I dealt with the guy portrayed in the film by Benjamin Bratt, Roberto Ocaheno, who was one of the bigger transporters of cocaine, moving tens of thousands of kilos of cocaine a year through pipelines. That's commercial businesses that are disguised to move that type of thing. And my two principal clients at that stage became two guys who later became much more well-known, Gerardo Moncada and Fernando Galeano. So if your listeners watch the first year of Netflix, the last two episodes, they introduced the characters, Gerardo Moncada and Fernando Galeano. They managed Pablo Escobar's routes. So he gave 60% over to Moncada, 40% over to Galeano, and then they paid him for the privilege of being able to use those routes that he had established. And as he began to have virtually a war with the government of Colombia, he imposed a war tax on them and other very high members of the Medellin cartel, starting off at about $200,000 a month, then going to about $1 million a month. And as is the case at times when people feel that their tax rate's too high, Moncada and Galeano were accused by Escobar to have siphoned off some of the money. They found in a hole, which in Spanish it's a coleta, it's a hole in one of the rental properties that was jointly owned by Moncada and Galeano. I think there was $23 million in currency there, but part of the problem was that the currency at the bottom of the hole had decayed, giving indication that it had been there for quite some time. So they were both accused of being thieves of the Medellin cartel at a time when they really wanted that money to fight the Colombian government. So Escobar summoned them. At this time he was in the cathedral, his self-made jail, and he had them summoned before him, his sicarios, and he had hundreds of sicarios, those are murderers, hoisted them by their ankles with ropes, hung them upside down. Eventually they used blowtorches to melt the skin off their bodies. Then they chopped them up into little pieces, and from there they turned them into ash. And nobody's ever seen Gerardo Moncada or Fernando Galeano since then. And he then went after their blood siblings, killing some of them, and then everybody who worked for them. So in short order, there were about 19 bodies that were found strewn throughout Medellin. It was called the internal cleansing that was being carried out by Pablo Escobar. But he didn't get everybody. And those who survived the internal cleansing later gathered together and formed Los Pepes, the vigilante group, people being persecuted by Pablo, and they wound up taking justice into their own hands, hunting down members of the Medellin cartel and giving them a choice: cooperate or be killed. And they started blowing up assets of Pablo Escobar's, trying to flush him out. And eventually, in December of 1993, that came to a conclusion when the Colombian National Police cornered him in a house, and he was shot to death.
Oh my! All right, let's take another short break, and we'll come back with Robert Mazur. He is author of the book The Betrayal: The True Story of My Brush with Death in the World of Narcos and Launderers. It's the follow-up to The Infiltrator, which we were just talking about. All right, back with more in a moment. We're going to take a deep dive into the Betrayal, which is his second book. And you can learn more about Robert Mazur at robertmazur.com. Last name spelled M-A-Z-U-R. Back on Speak Out, I'm Paul Lavoie with author Robert Mazur. Are you still getting used to being called an author, by the way?
Yeah, well, once a cop, always a cop. But, yeah, I do enjoy writing, and I do enjoy sharing this information with the public. They paid my salary. They deserve to know, as long as I can lawfully tell the story of what's really going on out there, because what's really going on is oftentimes not exactly in sync with what they are necessarily hearing from bureaucrats and politicians.
Oh, sure. Speak Out brought to you in part by Horizon Community Bank, also Mojave Community College, GDK LLC, SunPower by Esme Electric, Herbs, and by Thane O'Brien with Spot On Point of Sale Processing. Call Thane 928-706-2784 or send an email to TO'Brien with an E at spoton.com. And don't forget, we're also on the Lake Havasu City app where you can hear this interview and more, available at Google Play and the Apple iStore. And kind of talked a little bit about this off the air with you, but when you go undercover, you meet the bad guys, obviously, and you're dealing with them, business transactions and that, but you're also dealing with their families, and there's people, I call them the innocents or the civilians, that are involved in this, and how, they're implicated with truly bad people. How do you deal with that, knowing the good will probably go down with the bad?
Well, and certainly you have to recognize that you're going to have an impact, even on people not charged with crimes, on the spouses and on the children. That's going to be, a life-changing event. You've got to recognize that you're going to be dealing with even people that are not going to get charged with crimes. So these are spouses and children. It is a challenging thing to deal with at times. It can be for some it's not. For me it was. I like to say that, I hope that I have a conscience, and I want the government to have a conscience. And for me to take lightly and celebrate that, to me, that it's just not me. It's not what I'm all about. So, even with respect to the bankers, I knew that those bankers were going to go down and they were going to get pretty long sentences. You have to recognize that you're going to have an impact on people's lives who are not even going to be charged with crimes. Mm-hmm. And with respect to the senior bankers that I dealt with, who some got charged and imprisoned for 12 years, once that verdict came down, and everybody that was charged in that particular trial was convicted, and by the way, that was a 6-month trial, and during that trial, I was on the witness stand for 3 months.
Wow.
Every single court day from the middle of March till the middle of June that year, that's where you'd find me, in the courtroom. So, when ultimately I was informed that they had all been convicted, by then my wife and I and my 2 kids, we really needed to get away from all of this stuff. I took a month off and rented a motorhome, and we went up into the Smoky Mountains, but they eventually got word to me. And when I heard about it, and I'm not ashamed to say it, this is the absolute truth, I struggled with the concept that, okay, I'm an agent, and I did the same thing that the bankers did, and I did it with them. So I participated in that laundering. I'm going to get an award. They're going to go to prison for 12 years, and the impact on their families is significant. Now, it's not my fault. I was just doing my job. But I still felt very emotional about it. And literally for, a brief period of time while I was sitting there in the middle of the woods, I cried. But I always say, other people were at parties thinking it was the greatest thing that ever happened in the world. I knew that these were life-changing moments, and I knew that I was personally most responsible for those life-changing moments. And it's your conscience who, coming back. And I think it's good for governments to have a conscience. If I was out partying, celebrating the demise of other people, I let the law do the job. The jury did the job, the judge did the job, the prosecutors did the job, and I got the evidence. So, I mean, I just did my job, but it's still something that I think was well portrayed in the Infiltrator film when you saw the chemistry between Bryan Cranston playing me and Benjamin Bratt, who was playing the role of Roberto Alcaino. There was a bond that he and I had developed, even though he was not a nice guy and a guy responsible for putting a lot of poison on the streets of the United States.
Yeah, absolutely. So we got a text from a listener while you were answering that question before you mentioned that you had a wife and 2 kids. Is your family still intact from all this?
Thank God, yes. And I owe that to my best friend, my wife. You know, when you're going through undercover training and when you're picked to do this type of work, looking to see whether the candidate is going to be a person that's likely to stay grounded is an important factor. The worst thing that you could possibly do is select a new agent who's newly married, whose wife just had a child,
right, and
send him to another side of the country where there's no family and friends to support the spouse. And, you know, that's a formula for disaster. I am blessed that I have had a best friend since I was 17, she was 16. And our kids, 9 and 11, at the time that I started the 2-year infiltration of the Medellin cartel. But my mom and dad lived in the area, as did my brother and his family, so she had support. Most importantly, she had her own career. She's an educator, first-grade teacher, who was very, very dedicated to mentoring and training first graders. So she had a lot of things that were going on, and she's the type of person who uniquely was able to manage this. I'm not suggesting that I was the best husband in the world by any means, but the fact that I am still married to my high school sweetheart is not something that a lot of people that do this type of work can say.
Yeah, that's amazing. With the work that you do, you are truly a blessed man, Robert Mazur. But let's talk about your second book, The Betrayal. It's based on the Cali cartel, which was after the Medellin cartel went down, from what I remember anyway, and it's based on money laundering. Kind of give us a synopsis. What is the book about?
Sure. Well, after the Infiltrator trials were over, I was recruited by the Drug Enforcement Administration to do a long-term undercover operation and joined that agency. So I transferred over to DEA. I went through Quantico, the same training that all DEA agents go through, and I was given an opportunity to put together another long-term front. This time, another Italian-American businessman front. And again, the first name Robert, but this time the last name was Baldassare. And I had some very quality informants who were able to help us to put that together. I had a mortgage business, actually an international finance trade business, and several other businesses in both the United States and Panama. So in that particular case, our goal was to infiltrate the Cali cartel in a similar fashion to what we had done with regard to the Medellin cartel, but now the Cali cartel had taken over as the largest, most powerful drug cartel on the planet. And that was a little bit of a challenge because Cali is only a couple of 100 miles from Medellin. And, you know, a lot of people were killed that I used to deal with in the Medellin cartel, but, you know, one never knows. So I did go out of my way to change my appearance quite a bit, but
right. I was
never did run into anybody else from my old days in the Medellin cartel, thankfully. But what's the twist in this case is that we started off and really hit it big. I was dealing with people who were working directly with Miguel Rodriguez Orjuela, who's the head of the Cali cartel, and other major players. But all of a sudden, things started to go strange, and two of the people that I dealt with who were based in Bogota were not acting normal whatsoever. And as it turns out, unfortunately, one of the officers who was assigned to work with me undercover was actually on the take of the Cali cartel. Unbeknownst to me, a year and a half or so before I even started working with that officer. He was already involved in drug trafficking, money laundering, and corruption. So he nearly got me killed because I was doing undercover work in many different locations outside the U.S., Panama quite a bit, Colombia some. There's no doubt in my mind that on the occasion when I went to Colombia for meetings, the people that he outed me to, who were trying to get me to stay longer than I was supposed to, were probably trying to plan my being kidnapped, and I would have never come back. So the betrayal, though, as I wrote the book, The Betrayal, the two-dimensional betrayal, the obvious betrayal, is one of my colleagues who nearly got me killed. But as I got into the story deeper and deeper, there were other betrayals that are very, very obvious to me. A betrayal by the pillars of the community, of the banking and business world, who help these people to launder their money all over the globe. And there's also a betrayal, in my view, within government. That's very obvious. That, I think it was Albert Einstein who was credited with this, with the definition of insanity being doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different outcome. We have to face the fact that, despite the types of cases that I worked on and many other officers, because I'm no lone wolf, there are lots and lots of officers, and there are officers, men and women out there today, putting their life on the line, who are trying to be a part of making a difference. But the reality is that the techniques that we use and the priorities that we give are giving us the same outcome, which is a lack of success. And there are some critical things that we need to be doing that we're not doing in order to try to even begin to get a handle on this. There's more drugs out there. There's more overdose. I saw a thing yesterday, 105,000 overdoses in 2021 in the United States from fentanyl alone. That's not a success. And the amount of drugs that are moving around, it's 10 times what it used to be. Corruption, could you imagine that this would be something that would happen today in today's world? Just at the end of last year, the Drug Enforcement Administration, which has a wonderful unit called the Special Operations Division, it's a small group, it's a very elite group, and they work on cases all over the world. They finally identified a guy who went by a alias of El Padrino, the Godfather, who was working with a Mexican cartel, enabling them to get free passage of large drug shipments, getting them information about what was going on in the law enforcement world to try to stop them. When they ultimately identified him, he was General Cienfuegos, the Secretary of Defense for the entire nation of Mexico. Oh, wow. And we arrested him. He was held in San Diego, but within a month's period of time, the Mexican government put so much pressure that then Attorney General Barr decided to give him back to the Mexicans, who claimed that they were going to pursue the evidence fairly. Within a short period of time, of course, they came to the conclusion that he had not done anything wrong, and they dusted him off, and, now he's got no problems. So, we have a situation in Honduras where we just indicted the former president of Honduras, Juan Orlando Hernandez. His brother sits in prison in the United States for the rest of his life. We've probably got 10 Honduran senators who are sitting in prison, and many prominent business people who were involved in allowing that country to be used as a transshipment point. Things like that happen every single day because of the unbelievable amounts of corruption spread through the power of the money that's controlled by the cartels.
So we only have a couple minutes left, and boy, I really like to talk about El Chapo Guzman, but we really don't have a lot of time. I want to tell people how they can get your book. Is it in print yet, and is it being distributed?
Yes, it is in print. It's being distributed. If you go on my website, you'll find both the Betrayal and the Infiltrator pages. And if you click on Buy Book, it'll take you right to Amazon, the Amazon pages where they're offered. My book, The Infiltrator, was, the movie version came out in 2016. The Betrayal there was an early release by Amazon, but now officially all 4 versions, the hardcover, the paperback, the Kindle, and the audiobook, which I read, are now out effective April 1. So you can get them there, and there's already 600 or 700 plus reviews about the book. It is, in Kindle, it is a #1 bestseller, and it's #1 in about 4 or 5 different categories.
Well, that's fantastic. Congratulations on that. Again,
thank you.
The website is robertmazur.com. Robert Mazur, Mazur spelled M-A-Z-U-R, robertmazur.com. And best of luck. And I have so much more to talk about. I was going to talk to you about Bitcoin and some other things as well. Cryptocurrency. And I'm sure we could do a whole nother, at least a half hour on that topic as well. But thanks so much for joining us today. And best of luck.
Thank you very much, and thank you so much for the invitation.
Oh, you're so welcome. Again, the book is called The Betrayal, The True Story of My Brush with Death in the World of Narcos and Launderers by Robert Mazur. And again, you can get the book, either of those versions that he talked about, robertmazur.com. All right, we'll be back with more on Speak Out in a moment. Stay with us. I'm Paul Lavoie.